roughly close to about 400 million people. To put that in perspective, that is just a little short of the population of the European Union. It is a region of extremes, countries with large populations, countries with extremely small populations. One thing we may not think of is over half the population live in cities. Is a region experiencing rapid population growth. In some countries, the population under 15 exceeds 50%. It obviously has harsh climates, limited groundwater, scarce arable land. On the other hand, it is blessed with abundant natural resources. Obviously, we talk about crude oil, but there's also phosphates. Phosphates are, of course, essential for fertilizers. Morocco alone provides has 30% of the world's resources of phosphates. It's also iron ore, coal, copper. Interestingly, the Middle East trades mainly, because of the resources, with industrial economies, not so much between themselves. Most striking, however, I think, for long-term development is the state still retains a key role as an employer. Now, we are seeing moving from crisis now to a rebuilding mode, and the challenge is to, as we move forward for political reform, into economic reform. And that's what our panelists will talk about. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. Sitting nearest to me is Hisham Foad. We found out that we had many paths that have crossed. He's from Cincinnati, I'm from Cleveland. Of course, you know, Cleveland just won the football game this weekend. He's currently a professor of economics and director of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies at San Diego State University. His research focuses on international migration effects on trade and investment across countries. He's been published in the Journal of International Money and Finance, the Review of Middle East Economics and Finance, and the Quarterly of Journal of Finance. He has been actively participating in research conferences around the world. He's a consultant has been a consultant at the Heritage Auction and on the editorial board of Smart Economist. He teaches courses primarily on the Middle East and developmental economics. He received his PhD in economics from Emory University. Sitting to his right is Augustus Richard Norton, who's a faculty member actually in two departments, International Relations and Anthropology at Boston University, where he also serves as the director of the Institute for Iraqi Studies. He has served as a visiting professor at Oxford University, has also held positions at New York University and the United States Military Academy. His current research focuses on intersectarian relations in the Middle East and reformist Muslim thought. He has published very, very widely. His books have focused on Hezbollah, the political tides in the Arab world, the role of UN peacekeepers, and security in the Middle East. He has been an advisor to the Iraqi Study Group, better known as the Baker-Hamilton Commission. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and co-founder of the Conference Group on the Middle East and also the Boston Forum on the Middle East. He has held senior Fulbright research fellowships in Egypt, Kuwait, Bangladesh, Egypt again, Jordan, Lebanon, as well as Norway, and he received his PhD from the University of Chicago. And sitting on the far right from me is Riza Demirer, who is an associate professor of finance at the Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville since 2003. His research focuses on asset pricing and risk management issues in emerging stock markets. He has recently published in Energy Economics, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of International Financial Markets, Institutions and Money, and the Journal of Applied Finance. He is a reviewer for many academic journals as well as the National Science Foundation, and is a member of the Financial Management Association, the American Economic Association, the Middle East Economic Association, and the U.S. Association for Energy Economics. He is a native of Turkey and has his PhD from the University of Kansas. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished group to elucidate the topics of the economics of the Middle East. And I'll turn first to Foad, please.
Well, thank you, Dean Murphy. Thank you to Stephen F. Austin University and everybody here for sticking around till the very end. Hopefully we'll keep the momentum of what has been a really great conference going. Winston Churchill once said that there's only two things harder than making an after-dinner speech. That is climbing a wall that's leaning towards you or kissing a girl that's leaning away from you. So hopefully that doesn't apply to after-lunch speeches. Got to get this going. The symbolic start of the Arab Spring, one of the symbolic starts, was when a young man named Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire. Now, this was a young man who had a produce cart that he used to push around the streets of his small town in Tunisia. And he didn't have enough money to buy the necessary goods, so he would buy, the produce, the lettuce, what have you, on credit. And he was constantly being harassed by the local authorities, the police that were trying to get him to get a permit, to give him a bribe, and really just a feeling of hopelessness that he would never be able to, provide for his family, to reach some kind of future that, we in America maybe sometimes take for granted. And so this resonated with a lot of people in the Middle East because it presented itself as a microcosm of a lot of the economic problems that people in the Middle East face. Now, as Dean Murphy had mentioned, that when we think of the economy of the Middle East, we need to be careful not to be treating this as a monolith. There's quite a bit of differences across the region. We have countries that are extraordinarily wealthy, like Qatar and the UAE, where per capita incomes dwarf those even here in the U.S. We have countries that are remarkably poor, Yemen and the Sudan, where incomes per capita are $2,000 per person per year, and that's adjusting for differences in the cost of living. So keeping that in mind, the fact that we have rich countries, poor countries, countries that are abundant in natural resources, countries that lack these resources, countries which are labor exporters, countries which import labor. Keeping in mind all those differences, the focus of my talk is going to be looking at three really important commonalities that not every country in the Middle East has, but a number of them do, that are really key issues that are going to be affecting not only economic development in the region, but also any chance for political reform, because you can't separate economics and politics when we're looking at this region. Those three aspects that I want to focus on are labor markets, the quality of institutions, and government involvement in the economy, particularly through subsidies. Let's focus on labor markets. The unemployment rate in a lot of MENA countries is well over 15%, and that's just from the official data that we have. In some places, it may be well over 30% unemployment. People have a hard time finding jobs, and what's particularly notable about many Middle Eastern countries is that there's a lot of unemployment amongst skilled workers. So you have a lot of people that have an education that you would anticipate being able to find a job that cannot. And so not only is this a waste of human capital, where you have people that have skills that can't find jobs, but this is actually, a number of studies have found that if we take a look at a lot of people that participate in terrorist attacks, suicide bombers, for example, they tend to be more educated than the average population. And so, in fact, it's not so much poverty that can lead to a lot of this, but rather idleness and a feeling of hopelessness. And so this is a pretty significant issue. As people mentioned in an earlier session today, there is a pretty significant youth bulge in the region. And this is a youth bulge that's really been due to the fact that you had past rates of very high fertility. It's a very young population. Many countries, the median age is in the early 20s. And with this bottom-heavy age distribution, you have presented with a number of challenges that maybe you don't have in a bit of an older population. You have a lot of young people that are entering into the labor force. And as we have some young people here in college who are going to be looking for jobs when you get out of here, you would like to be able to find a job. Well, the same thing holds in the Middle East. There's been a number of studies that try to project, how many jobs need to be created. And so one study, it's a bit dated, it's from 2004, said that by 2020, 80 million new jobs would need to be created across the region just to maintain current levels of unemployment, the current already high levels of unemployment. And so the question becomes, where do those jobs come from? In the past, the public sector provided some of those jobs. In the past, the military absorbed a lot of these young people. But it's not really clear that that's going to be able to continue. And the public sector in some countries, fueled by natural resource revenues or fueled by aid from the West, is getting smaller. The military, unable to stay at its same size. Right? So where are the jobs going to be coming from? Right? Or are they not going to come at all? Well, first off, maybe this is a temporary issue. There's been a significant drop in fertility rates across the region. And this provides what's known as something called a demographic dividend, which may lead to fruition. So the demographic dividend is the fact that all these young people that are now entering into the labor market, there's not sort of this following generation of high fertility that's coming in. It's not guaranteed to generate a dividend, the fact that these people are going to be working, they're not going to have to support as many people, but it might work out. But in the meantime, the more immediate issue is let's find jobs for these people. Where are they going to get these jobs? Now, in the past, migration has acted as a bit of a safety valve, where people couldn't find jobs in certain countries and they would move to others. And so North Africa, a lot of people would move to Europe, Turkey. There's a lot of migration to Germany. In Egypt and some of the Levant, people would move to the Gulf states. Increasingly, there's limited opportunities for migration, in particular unskilled migration. So there's an increasing anti-migration sentiment across Europe, and especially since the 1991 Gulf War, there's been a preference for the Gulf countries for migration from South Asia, less so from the Arab world. So this leaves us with the conclusion that the only place where people can come from, or where the jobs are going to come from, is going to be the private sector. But why hasn't the private sector provided the jobs for the people that need them? Well, there's some fairly weak institutions across the region. So I'm just going to read you some statistics. This is from the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report. If you want to start a business in Yemen, for example, that's going to cost you about 84% of the average income in Yemen. Contrast that with the U.S., it's about 1.5% average income. So really costly if you want to start a business. In Israel, which is actually one of the more developed and functional economies, you want to start a business, it takes you about 34 days. So a little more than a month. Compare that to the U.S., 6 days is the amount of time it takes to start a business. If you want to enforce a contract, you have a contract, there's a breach of contract, you want to enforce that, operating through the bureaucracy, through the legal system. In Egypt, that's going to cost you about a quarter of the value of that contract. So you're going to lose 25% of that contract in just enforcing it. In the U.S., it's about 14%. If your business goes under, you have to go bankrupt. In the UAE, again, one of the more functional economies, the recovery rate on that business is about 11 cents on the dollar. The recovery rate in the U.S., 82 cents on the dollar. So there's a lot of just general limitations on the private sector, which, you know, I mean, you're watching the debates, everybody's saying these are the engines of growth, this is where all these jobs are going to be coming from. Even more regulation, even more constraints being placed in the Middle East and North Africa. Corruption is a major problem. So there's an organization called Transparency International, which publishes something called a Corruption Perceptions Index. And this is attitudes within a country about how much of a problem corruption actually is. By and large, countries in this region do quite poorly in terms of corruption. Corruption is a major issue. Give you an example. Out of 182 countries, the Sudan ranks 177th. Iraq, 175th. Libya, 168th. Egypt does a little bit better, 112th. Right? So they're doing all right. You know, you have a couple other countries that have made reforms, so we don't want to treat this as a monolith. You know, it's the UAE, 28th out of the world, so that's not too bad. Qatar, 22nd. But again, this is self-reported perceptions of corruption, so we need to take these with a bit of a grain of salt. Okay. So reform is needed. How do you make these reforms? The government needs to maybe streamline some of these issues, but they face their own set of challenges. Now, many of the regimes across the Middle East are fairly authoritarian, lack a bit of political legitimacy, and the way that they've bought their political legitimacy is on the back of something called an authoritarian bargain. Now, what this authoritarian bargain basically is go to the people, you're going to give up some political freedom. You're going to give up political participation in some sort of democratic process, and in return, we're going to give you some kind of subsidy. Maybe it's cheap bread. Maybe it's electricity. Maybe it's gasoline. And in fact, across the region, you have, for example, $165 billion being spent on fuel subsidies. Over $20 billion being spent on subsidies for electricity and food. Right? Subsidized bread has become such a way of life in some countries that, in fact, the word for bread in Egyptian Arabic is aish, which is the same thing as life. Right? So, give an example of why these subsidies don't work. They're really unsustainable. They're completely tied up with corruption. So in Egypt, the way that the bread subsidy works is you go around to the government bakeries, and the government sells flour at a highly, highly subsidized price, maybe a tenth of the actual price of flour, to the government bakers. And the government bakery is supposed to bake a certain amount of loaves of bread and sell at a reduced price with that subsidized flour. Alternatively, if you're a government baker, what you could do is you could take the flour that you're supposed to bake bread with and you can sell it to the private bakery down the street. Well, what prevents you from doing this is you have an inspector that comes around to make sure, hey, we sold you 10 sacks of flour, you should have baked 500 loaves of bread. Well, the inspector maybe makes $40, $50 a month. And so it doesn't take much to bribe them. Right? And so these subsidies, by imposing a price which is well below the market price, leads to an overconsumption, leads to a shortage of these goods. In fact, the bread lines are crazy. The subsidized fuel is something that is unsustainable for these governments. So much so to the point where Egypt, which once was the breadbasket of the Middle East, now is the #1 importer of wheat in the entire world. Much of that coming from the U.S., about $4 billion of wheat exports from the U.S. For the Food for Peace program. This becomes a problem, especially in the late 2000s. So in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008, you get about a 40% increase in the price of bread. Food prices in general are rising. Now, as people have a hard time finding a job, they have a hard time putting food on the plate, they get upset. And what do? They protest. And so, April 6, 2008, a date maybe that should sound somewhat familiar to some people, you have an organized protest against the Mubarak regime in Egypt. One of the first times that you actually see, a strong, solidified movement against, this president who's been in power for a long time, to the point where you actually get the naming of this as the April 6th movement, which indirectly leads to, some of the organization that led to a lot of the protests in Tahrir Square. Now, these government subsidies are unsustainable. So much so to the point where a lot of the new regimes, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan even, not a new regime, but a regime facing many of these same issues, are facing serious debt crises. And so, for example, Egypt is on the verge of seeking IMF assistance. Jordan, same thing. Now, the IMF has its neoliberal economic reforms that it's going to be asking these countries to go through with. Cut government spending, cut these subsidies, get your budget deficits down. We don't want to throw good money after bad money. Unfortunately, if you're a government that's come to power on the back of an authoritarian bargain, where you're giving people these subsidized goods in exchange for their lack of political participation, you can't make these IMF reforms without breaking that bargain, and you're going to be out of power. So, you need to figure out some way to push these reforms through. In the case of Egypt, they're not going to seek IMF assistance until after parliamentary elections. In the case of Jordan, well, there's going to have to be probably an alliance between King Abdullah and the Islamists within Jordan in order to get those reforms accepted by the people. And so the problem that you run into in this region is that any time reforms have been attempted in the past, they've never been fully implemented. Because the regime that would try to fully implement reform knows that if it does so, it's signing its own death warrant in terms of political power. Reforms that have been partially implemented, they've been co-opted by corruption. They haven't translated into jobs, and the people on the street see these reforms that are being offered up, and they don't trust them anymore. Maybe they would have if they had gotten them right the first time, but now they don't. So what can the U.S. do to help? Well, ease the reform transition. Open up more trading links, perhaps. But in the end, I don't really know if there is a lot that can be done. So I'm not offering the most optimistic viewpoint. Really just wanted to highlight and identify some of the key economic issues that are driving some of this. So thank you for your time.
I taught for many years at West Point, as our chair mentioned. And I think in many respects, the most valuable thing I did at West Point was to teach young cadets, men and women, about anthropology. I taught the only anthropology course at West Point, among other things. I was there for 12 or 13 years. And that was an unusual thing for me to be teaching because I'd been trained as a political scientist at the University of Chicago. But I found that when I sort of got out into the field in Turkey, eastern Turkey, in Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, where I spent quite some time, that it was really not the political science courses that helped me very much. They were great in the salons of Cairo and Beirut, but it was really the discipline that focused on where the rubber hits the road that really helped me understand how people solve conflicts, how people live their lives, and that kind of thing. So in contrast to the last talk, which was very fine, looking at broad systematic problems, I really want to talk about 5 key issues and highlight how they affect people in their everyday lives. Some of these areas are areas where there are opportunities. Some of these are areas in which we can take some hopeful, if you will, some hopeful data. And in other areas, the problems are more impenetrable to outside intervention and perhaps even to internal remedy. And here are these 5 points. First, the importance of dignity. This has already been mentioned. I heard it mentioned this morning. Second, the erosion of living standards. Now I'm going to come back to each of these in detail. Third, the question of piety and what it means. Fourth, demographic factors, population growth, and so on. And fifth, youth, young people. Dignity, karama. If there was a word that resonated during the protest that began in late 2010 and accelerated in 2011 in Tunisia, Egypt, for a time in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, it was karama, dignity. People demanding their dignity. Of course, they were chanting, "Scram, get out of here. Scram, irhal, irhal, get out of here." Telling the rulers, get out of the way. We want change. But at base, there was a fundamental desire for dignity. Why? Because increasingly Middle Eastern political systems are systems that have been unresponsive to citizens' needs. In the middle of Egypt, in fact, you see it standing in the middle of Tahrir Square, looming over Tahrir Square, is the Mugama, the big government bureaucracy building. And you go in there, I see people smiling, you know it. You go in there, try and get something simple done, like get a permit. You have to pay bribe after bribe after bribe. I remember one day going in with my passport years ago. Used to have to get your passport registered with a police station, I think it was 7 days after you entered Egypt. Typically, if you stayed in the hotel would do it. But I wasn't staying in a hotel, so I decided I'd go to the Mugaba myself. It took me about half the day. Went in, somebody looked at the passport, gave me a little piece of paper, didn't do anything with it. Went to the next office, somebody looked at the piece of paper and stamped it. Somebody else initialed the stamp. I said, okay, now I'm getting somewhere. Somebody else stamped the stamp. By the time I finished, I had 4 or 5 stamps on the piece of paper, and that was before they even put anything in my passport. All the time, in fact, stubbornly refusing to pay bribes and slowing down the process. People want a government that's responsive. They don't want to go to a government where people aren't interested in helping them, where people aren't willing to address their problems. And this is very, very important. 2, 30 or 40 years ago in the Middle East, there was plenty of wealth, but it was hidden behind walls. Ostentatious displays of wealth were not so obvious. Nowadays, the rich, the government employees who seem to make enormous amounts of money on small salaries, live in these fancy apartments, drive nice cars. So the evidence, if you will, of distortions in the economy, in some cases just people who've made a lot of money, but in other cases people who've thrived on corruption, are pretty obvious. And of course, all of this moves around by virtue of access to the media. the satellite TV stations that people have access to, where themes like this have been increasingly debated for the last decade or so. Corruption is endemic, and people talk about it, and when they talk about it, they don't talk about our system. They talk about the system, al-sulta, the power. It's not like in the U.S. people might say our government. It's not our government. It's like an alien entity sitting on top of the people. In Bahrain, where I've done a fair amount of work, if you're in Manama or Muharraq, the two main cities, you can't find a beach. Why? Because all the good property is owned by private individuals. It's known that you can't get anything done by way of development without giving the prime minister, who's been in power a little while since Bahrain became independent in 1971, without giving the prime minister 10% bribe. So this issue of dignity and all the things that inflame people's sense of indignity is very palpable and important. And if you work in the Middle East, you see it every day. You hear stories about it every day. Related to this, the second thing, the erosion of living standards. I know people, and those of you who travel in the Middle East, you have many stories of the same sort, who have 2, 3, 4 jobs. Yes, for example, in Egypt, the government has a kind of contract with the population. Graduate from secondary school or college and we'll give you a good job. Waiting time, last time anybody checked, about 7 years. Not a good job. So it's not unusual to find someone with a government job driving a taxi and then working with his cousin in the bazaar, the market, trying to peddle things to tourists and that kind of thing. People working nonstop. A simple thing, taking kids to school. There's no sort of school bus system in Cairo. You take your kids to school. I lived several times in Zamalek, which is a nice suburb in Cairo. There are all kinds of traffic jams for routine, predictable reasons, but also because you have all these people trying to come pick up their kids from school and struggling to pay school tuition and buy books and all that kind of thing. People find, we worry about the recession we've been through here in this country, but people are facing oftentimes much more severe economic challenges. They're worried about their kids getting jobs. We have data now, by the way, the economic data is very sketchy because whatever we know, we have to put a big question mark with it because why? Because, for example, in Egypt, the informal economy is estimated by the World Bank to represent about 50% of the formal economy. So in other words, you get a whole realm of economic activity which is undocumented, right? So the data is sketchy. But what we do know is that, as was mentioned, unemployment rates listed by the government are usually strikingly high, and they're usually strikingly lower than they really are. In terms of people who have jobs that allow them to support families and that sort of thing. And the erosion of living standards over the years has become worse in many of these countries. You look at Syria. Syria is a country where, in former decades, the government imposed a system of land reform, and the government paid a lot of attention to providing subsidies to farmers and that kind of thing. The periphery received a lot of attention in Syria. Over the past decade or so, with the restructuring of the economy, special deal for capitalists retrieving or basically repatriating money to Syria and so on, a lot of the resources that the state was distributing to the peripheral areas stopped going out there. So you look at where the casualties have been in Syria. Places many of us have never heard of. Idlib, Deir ez-Zor, for example, Dada in the south. These are areas which have suffered 10%, 15% of the total casualties in the ongoing civil war. And by the way, total number of civilian casualties now are estimated to be well over 25,000, going north towards 30,000. These are areas where you have important motives for opposing and toppling this government because people feel that the government really has stopped paying attention to their needs long ago. Piety. Piety comes in many flavors. That's not surprising for anyone in the U.S. How many kinds of Christians are there here in the U.S.? Jews, Muslims. In the Middle East, yes, it's a time of rising piety. I heard that point made the other day. No question about it. People talk more about religion than they did 20, 25, 30 years ago. No question about it. But piety in many flavors. I have a couple of colleagues working on youth population right now in Beirut, writing a very good book, which we're going to be publishing before too long in a series I edited at Princeton. Mona Harb and Laura Deeb, looking at youth culture among Shia Muslims in Lebanon. What do they find? Yeah, these young people are religious. They talk about taqwa. They talk about piety. But they sort of choose how to be pious. So such and such and I told them, well, he's smart about this, and this one has good things to say about young people and issues like birth control and different kinds of things. And they sort of take one thing from this shelf and one thing from that shelf. So there's a lot of sort of constructed piety. A lot of the Islamist movements that we find in the Middle East are very much inspired, in many cases, by charismatic leaders who are self-taught, who claim to be scholars in Islam, autodidacts, and so on, with many different interpretations of what it means. We see good evidence for this in Tunisia. We certainly see it in Egypt as well. So yes, rising piety, but many different varieties of piety. Some very conservative, some much less so. I heard comments about Salafists this morning. Yes, some of these Salafists are very conservative, but they're also moderate Salafists. I know Salafists who basically are very tolerant of others, talk about themes like toleration, tasammuh, and things like that. Very enlightened views about the role of women in society. But they're a Salafist in the sense they want to destroy all the institutions that have risen up over the centuries created by the Islamic schools of law and so on, because they see these as sort of denizens of corruption and misinterpretation. So they want to go back to a version of Islam which they see as purer, but not to make life more puritanical, if I can use that term, but basically because they see this as a way of sort of overturning many of the people who have, as they see it, misconstrued and misused and abused religion in their work and often their connection to government. I won't go on too long about demography because there have been several very valid points already made. But let me just hit a couple of things. One, of course, the gigantic youth bulge. That will change over time. The rates of population growth are declining. One of my best friends in Lebanon was one of 17 siblings, one mother, a little bit younger than I am. It was very typical of his generation. So, can you imagine? That poor woman, and by the way, she's still alive and healthy, and my friend isn't. So, but in any case, you don't see that. You see particularly middle-class families nowadays having 2 or 3 kids. Why? They're worried about the cost of education. They're worried about them getting a job. And they're more confident that babies will survive infancy. They're more confident that their 2 or 3 children will be able to have good careers and help them as they get older in life. But for now, still a gigantic youth bulge. In Gaza, which is really a horror story in many ways, thanks in significant part to the policy of the United States of America and Israel, I must add. Gaza, which is really a basket case, you have kids going to elementary school grades in 3 shifts at the schools run by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Imagine that. You have horrible drinking water, by the way, unsafe for children, lots of other things. But basically, a youth bulge, about 50% of the population below the age of 20. Imagine what this signifies for higher education. Over time, literacy rates have gone up, actually very dramatically from one generation to the next in the Middle East. They're still much too low in many places. In Egypt, they're just over 50%, a little bit below 50 for women, above 50 for men. But you look at the rate of change over time, from 10% a couple of generations ago to the present, very dramatic changes. But think about the institutional burden of building schools, building colleges, providing places, and providing a good education. Yes, Saudi Arabia trains many young people in colleges and vocational schools, but they don't train them with skills that allow them to work in a modern economy. Many of them are trained in religious sciences, Islamic sciences, and so on, in religious thought. They don't have marketable skills in a modern economy. The importance of marriage. You know, in Arab culture, Middle Eastern culture, really, in Turkey, Iran, same phenomenon. Marriage is a contract between families. People usually, sometimes they elope, and there are circumstances under which you can get married less formally than big ceremonies and all of that. And for example, in Shiite Islam, there's a phenomenon of temporary marriage, where you can get married for an hour, or a day, or a weekend, or whatever. To avoid sin, you can get married. That's an interesting institution. But for most people, marriage, as we usually consider it, is a compact between families. And there's a strong tradition that men pay what's called the bride's price, mahar it's called. Basically, this bride's price is money that the man is expected to bring into the marriage to help to basically provide security for the woman he's marrying. He's expected to have a place to live. He's expected to have appliances and all that sort of thing. He's expected to make gifts to the family of his bride. And the bride's price can be tens of thousands of dollars. People know what it is. They'll talk about it. In fact, one of the incentives for marrying a cousin is when you're marrying within your family, and first cousin marriage is still fairly common. In fact, in many ways, ideologically, it's the preferred marriage pattern. When you're marrying within your family, one incentive for doing that is you have a lower bride's price. You know the bride, you know the groom, but also the bride's price would be lower. But the idea of getting married, so it's not just getting a job, having employable skills, but it's the ability to become a full member of society. The age of marriage, and this affects obviously population growth rates, the age of marriage has increased, and that may be a good thing demographically, but it's a source of enormous frustration among young people who have to wait to get married. So you really have to register this. This is something that's very, very significant. People talk about it all the time. In fact, you have a phenomenon in Cairo, something that is kind of interesting to think about, and that is that in Cairo, there's actually a surplus of flats. You wouldn't know it because it's hard to find a flat, particularly if you want to buy on the local, rent a flat on the local market, not coming as a foreigner with lots of green bills. If you're looking for a place to rent, it's very hard to find a place. But there are all these vacant places. Why? Because in Egypt, you have strong rent control laws. And people who own apartments aren't willing to rent them because they're afraid they'll never get the tenants out. I have friends who are very wealthy who actually live in 2 apartments in Zamalek, and they're mostly beautiful apartments, I must say. It's something like $22 because of rent control. So people aren't willing to rent. So that's a distortion that's institutionalized. And they hold these apartments and they let their kids have the apartments. That's the idea, right? So you have some economic distortions that exist in the market that reflect some of these problems as well. So these are things that people talk about. You go out at night, have a cup of tea, smoke shisha with someone, have coffee with someone, sit in a cafe, young person, I guarantee you this comes up. This issue that comes up. Getting a job, being able to actually afford to get married and that kind of thing. And more than here, my last point on this, to be a full-fledged member of the society, you have to be married. Here, you can be single and be fine. But in Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., to be a full-fledged member of society, you're married. Otherwise, you're really not quite a full adult. Fifth, I've been talking about youth, but let me hit some key points that I haven't hit already. 1, lots of discussion among young people. I mentioned the question of piety already and so on, but lots of discussion and lots of knowledge about how things are done in the world. Lots of reference points. People in the Middle East have been looking for years for sort of exemplars, for models of change. They looked with great hope for a time in the 90s at Yemen, which then erupted into a civil war. They looked at Algeria in the early 1990s. You know, they've been looking for models. They've been fascinated by Turkey. So what they have now is a model. But they've been talking a lot about change, particularly young people. And by the way, they know what democracy is. They know what freedom means. Now, of course, there's no cookie-cutter democracy. Democracy is a process. You know, as a theorist I know once said, he said, look, living democratically is living experientially. And by definition, living experientially is living dangerously. So, you know, you don't know how this process is going to work out, but it's a process. It's not a settled fact. It's not like having a red hat or a blue hat. It's a process. And in fact, one very smart scholar, Dankwart Rostow, years ago, talked about democracy or democratization, becoming more democratic, as a process of habituation, getting used to the rules of the game, learning how electoral systems work. Iraqis have had to do that. They've had to learn how systems work, how parties operate. In many instances, in situations where real political parties weren't allowed to exist. In Egypt, before the 25th of January events and after, there were political parties, the WAFT, the Environmental Party, and so on, the Liberal Party. But most of them were nothing. They were boutiques. They had little newspapers that very few people read. They didn't really have a following. They didn't really have a base. And young people are savvy about this stuff. They follow it. They talk about it. They're on the internet. And by the way, cell phones, very, very important. Everybody has a cell phone. By the way, you know what a missed call is? Some of you may not know what a missed call is. We don't use this term. Some of you say they use the term in English, missed call. Give me a missed call. They'll say in Arabic, give me a missed call. What's a missed call? A missed call is when you call somebody, and when you're on the receiving end, you see the phone come in, you turn off the phone. You don't answer it. Why? Because people have these little cheap cell phones, Nokia, Samsungs, and everything, and you can get a card. You can get a SIM to fit in the phone with as little as $5 worth of credit. Now, if you make phone calls, that's burned up. But you signal people with missed calls. I'm going to meet you at such a place, but I'm there, I'll give you a missed call. Okay, he's there now, she's there now. And they text. Texting is cheap. Calls are expensive. Texting is cheap. So lots of texting. You can be in a room 1,000 miles away from what's happening. I remember one time I was in the Gulf with a bunch of Egyptians, and, you know, hours and hours away from Cairo. Something was going on in Cairo. It was a rumor about Mubarak being dead. And everybody, within minutes, had the same kind of information from a disparate variety of sources. People are connected in a way that we don't really fully appreciate. Yeah, the internet's important, but, you know, a lot of that still, for people with less money, that's in internet cafes and that kind of thing. But these other cheaper forms of technology, very, very important. So look, there's a lot going on there in the region. There's nothing that's going to be easy to solve about many of these problems. But the problems are real. People feel them. And, you know, in a sense, my colleagues, who I think sometimes spend too much time, you know, sipping the water inside the Beltway in Washington, some of my colleagues in Middle East studies, they were surprised about the uprisings, about this Arab awakening that began in 2011. They shouldn't have been surprised. They were too captured by paradigms about authoritarian regimes being flexible and adaptable and so on. They were ignorant about the debates taking place within Islamist movements themselves. It's not only among youth that things like pluralism and democracy are debated, they're debated within these Islamic movements. Now, we don't have access to that, a lot of us, because our Arabic isn't good enough. I have a PhD student, Ashraf al-Sharif, who's now back in Cairo, who wrote, to my distress, a 1,000-page dissertation. Very good. I mean, cut it 350 pages, but a very good dissertation detailing those debates within the Muslim Brotherhood, outside of the Muslim Brotherhood, peripheral units in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and so on, in Morocco. So those debates are going on. They're real. And, you know, we're going to be living with this for some time to come. And, God willing, we'll have some leadership here in the U.S. that'll be smart enough not to demonize what's going on, not to ostracize it, not to get up on some damn soapbox about it, but actually think constructively in some ways that people have already mentioned here today to help foster a long process of change, reform, and really reconstruction. Thank you very much.
Speakers talked about unemployment problems, youth bulge. Well, employment opportunities and economic growth comes from investment. Investment comes from capital. Capital comes from financing. So there's this cycle pretty much broken in many of the Middle Eastern and North African countries. So they are pretty much deglobalized in terms of tapping into capital markets, and that translates into underutilized economic potential in these countries. And we have these unemployment problem and all this social unrest in addition to the oppression from their governments. So I'm a finance person. I'll mostly talk about dollars, so I'll take it to a different direction. So we're looking at this region of the world, which is sitting on top of 48% of proved reserves of crude oil, which is the leading fuel in the world, 38% of natural gas. They account for 32% of global production, and they consume about 9% of global consumption. So it's a key region in the world. Thanks to all those petrodollars over the much of 2000s, many of these countries in the region experienced one of the highest growth rates in their gross domestic products, GDP growth rates. But I will still call them underutilized in terms of their economic potential. So just to give an example, if you compare Latin America and Middle East and North Africa, MENA region accounts for about 5% of total global population, and it accounts for about 1.7% of the share of the total global production. On the other hand, Latin American countries account for 8.5% of total population, and they account for 8% of global economic output. So the economic output from MENA countries is disproportionately smaller compared to their size. So they have a problem in what they can grow economically, what they can sell, and that translates into all kinds of unemployment and social problems that lead to social unrest. So I'll just try to give you an idea about what's happening, just using some numbers. We've already talked about high unemployment, large percentage of young people in these countries, and some of the highest GDP growth rates in the world, and all these natural resources in the region. You would expect a lot of investment interest from foreign countries to this region, right? What we call foreign direct investment, basically foreign firms, entrepreneurs investing in these countries. So they are one of the worst performing with sub-Saharan Africa, one of the worst performing regions when it comes to attracting foreign capital into their countries. So just a couple numbers. So 2011 numbers, we're looking at a pie of foreign direct investment for $1.4 trillion. Out of that pie, MENA countries were able to attract only 2.2% of foreign investments into their countries. 2.2%. Latin America is about 8.5%. Okay? Only 2%, 2.2%. Let me give you just background. Foreign direct investment means you will have foreign expertise, managerial expertise, not only foreign capital coming into your economy for growth and investment opportunities, but it's expertise, technology, managerial know-how coming into your country. Okay. Also, it doesn't only bring in new technology, but it stimulates related sectors, creates jobs. So it's a good thing. We want other countries investing in our economy. It will create jobs, and it will bring in capital, which we cannot create through domestic means. So 2.2% is a very disappointing number. So it's one dimension of how deglobalized economically the region is. Okay, just another number. Egypt, Arab Spring posted actually a foreign direct investment outflow of about $500 million last year, compared to more than $6 billion inflow. So there's a big economic cost of Arab Spring, just for the record. Even though it's a good thing for their people, there's a big economic cost. Looking at U.S. and MENA region, things are even worse. So look at total U.S. trade. The Middle East and North African countries account for less than 5% of total U.S. trade, less than 5%. Okay, so talking about what the U.S. can do to connect these economies to global worlds, first the U.S. has to look back and why don't we improve our trade first? And when you look at foreign direct investment from the U.S. into these countries, less than 1%. Okay, most of it going to Europe, Central Asia, Latin America. Less than 1% goes to the MENA region. So just dollars, couple of dollars. From U.S. to MENA region, $54 billion foreign direct investment, 1%. From MENA to U.S., foreign direct investment, $15 billion, 0.6% of their foreign investments into U.S. Half of it comes from Israel. So it's down to 0.3%. So you do the interpretation. So I take foreign direct investments as one dimension of economic globalization, and that's especially needed for countries in the Middle East and North Africa with this unemployment and social unrest problems. And I think policymakers first should set targets on, we want this much of our trade with these countries. Okay, okay, more. Looking at their stock markets, which is my research interest. Just a couple of back of the envelope type of calculations. Since the burst of the dot-com bubble, late 1990s, the return on the U.S. index, U.S. stock market, is actually a loss, 13% down, U.S. market, S&P index. Saudi Arabia, up 116%. Qatar, up 267%. Everything in dollar terms, dollars. So $1 in Qatar in 2000 turns into $3.67. And you lose 13% in the U.S. market. Tunisia, 158%. Egypt, 12%, even after the Arab Spring downturn. So all these statistics, the stellar performance of their stock markets, should suggest that there would be a lot of portfolio investments, financial market investments going to into these countries. It's even less than sub-Saharan Africa. So we're looking at a big portfolio equity inflow pie. This is the recent number, 2011, $780 billion. In that pie, MENA accounts for 0.38%. 0.38%. Sub-Saharan Africa is 1.03%. Okay? These are global mutual funds, portfolio investors investing their money into these markets. Okay? So they are detached from foreign direct investors. They are detached from capital markets. And keep in mind, stock markets are critical to economic growth because stock market is a way for entrepreneurs, corporations to get financing for their investment needs, right? And opening up to global capital markets means you can you have access to global cash, and you can get access to this global cash at a lower rate of return because global investors have lower, more diversified portfolios compared to local investors. So they will require lower rates of return to put money into Egyptian stocks or Tunisian stocks. Okay? So it means for an average local firm, it means reduced cost of capital. Cost of cash will be lower, and they are losing the opportunity on that. Okay, only 0.38% of the global portfolio pie. So again, that's another dimension of how deglobalized the region is economically. When you do some research, look at the papers published on the region, a couple of bullet points on the obstacles to growth in the region. One is weak integration to global markets, and I think you have a pretty good idea about that now. Number two, non-democratic institutions, which limits competition in the financial sector and which brings about a lot of problems in terms of shareholder rights and enforcement of contracts, like what Hisham talked about. Export concentration. Well, 70% of the total exports from the MENA region is oil and gas, right? So they are not diversified in terms of the products they export. And since many of the countries in the region produce pretty much the same stuff, their trade within the region is very limited. Between 10 and 15% is the percentage of their trade between themselves. So regional trade, regional cooperation, hard to do. And finally, weak business environment. So, well, we had the Bernie Madoff case. We had these Enrons, WorldComs, all these, Martha Stewart went to jail for insider trading. So all of these things, without proper regulation and enforcement, free of political powers, that's another thing. Okay? So my research, so when you do cross-country analyses, MENA countries versus other regions in the world, there are two things that are statistically significant in separating these countries from the rest of the world. One is governance. So we talked about political governance, and let's leave it aside. We already talked about it. Economic governance, corporate governance, basically transparency of companies, their financial accounting standards. Basically what Enron did, right? So they were cooking the books and they cost the investors billions of dollars. So these are all different dimensions of corporate governance. Here's a couple of numbers from a 2008 survey by the International Finance Corporation. They surveyed managers in the region. 53% did not know what corporate governance means. So corporate governance is a set of rules that you manage a firm and the relationship between managers, board of directors, and shareholders. Big deal. Only 26% of boards of corporations had audit committees with a majority of independent directors. And 62% noted that board members used inside information for their benefits. So talk about, if that's the case, who wants to put money into those stock markets? When those corporations need your cash, domestic investments, to invest and grow. Which international investor will put money into those markets? So there are some things that advanced nations can do. Well, I'll give you an idea. But first of all, they have to fix their system, financial system and their regulatory system, so that they will attract the capital they need. Number two, lack of access to capital. We have what we term a quality gap in financial intermediation, which is the efficiency with which banks provide loans to entrepreneurs, to whoever needs cash. So if you have state domination of banks and the financial sector, that limits competition, that limits the quality of lending opportunities that you will offer to your entrepreneurs. Well, in that case, investment is pretty hard. Investment needs capital. To get the capital, you need the financial sector helping you out for getting that capital. Stock markets. Stock markets are grossly underpopulated. I already talked about why stock markets are important for financing needs for corporations. I need cash for my investments. I issue stocks or bonds, and I get the cash I need. In this way, I find shareholders who share the risks of my business. It's a big cycle. Okay? But when you look at the stock markets in the region, they are grossly underpopulated, which means they don't have enough listed stocks. They don't have enough sufficient number of corporations listed in the exchanges that represent the size of their economies. Saudi Arabia, the largest stock market in terms of market capitalization, has only 150 firms listed in the exchange. Israel has 576 firms listed in the stock exchange. Turkey has 362 firms. Bulgaria has almost 400 firms. Croatia has more than 200. Vietnam has 300. So we're looking at the largest stock market in the MENA region, Saudi Arabia. It has only 150 firms listed. So they need more corporations listed in their exchanges. The stock market activity, which is critical to economic growth, doesn't reflect the potential of those countries. That's why we call these markets frontier markets. They are not even emerging yet. Like Morgan Stanley has this classification: advanced stock markets, emerging, frontier. Frontier stock markets have all these problems. Underpopulated exchanges, liquidity problems. You see stock prices don't change for days. They don't trade. They are very illiquid. There are a lot of issues with transparency or timely disclosure of information to shareholders, to the market. These are very critical things if you want to attract investors for your financing needs. And they desperately want to achieve the emerging market status. They are working for it, a lot of exchanges. If they do so, they will have billions of dollars pool of global emerging funds investing in their stock market. It's a big, big deal. Once you're upgraded from frontier to emerging, you will have a lot of global emerging market funds automatically investing in your stock markets, which means providing capital, money and form. Another dimension of globalization, cross-listing, a corporation being listed in multiple exchanges. The picture is, again, pretty bad. You'll see Saudi Arabia is off limits for foreign investors. You can get to it. The country with the largest number of cross-listed firms is Egypt. 14 firms listed in both in Egypt and a couple of foreign stock markets. And again, cross-listing is another way of tapping into global money. You're listed, you're traded on multiple exchanges. Israel has 50 stocks cross-listed in the US, London, and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Turkey has 36. And you'll see Thailand has 52. So there are many things that they could do to tap into global markets for the cash they desperately need for growth, and they are not doing it. So there are problems. So a couple of my humble suggestions. What is the answer to some of these economic problems? So what can we do to push them for financial reforms, and at the same time to help them with their economic problems? Well, trade is the answer. Trade. Look at China. What would you say about China's democratic position? It's not a very democratic country, right? But economically, it's booming. And the booming economy, the growing global trade demands are pushing their economic reforms. China, over the past few years, started to privatize their banks, largest banks. Why? Because the state ownership cannot answer the needs for global trade. So more trade is pushing for reforms. So the first thing that the US and the advanced nations, I think, can do is trade, more trade. How is it possible? Well, I think the US has several free trade agreements with some of the countries, and they are considering Egypt and Tunisia to be added to the list. I think they should negotiate and renegotiate and revise those free trade agreements in the light of the Arab Spring to help them open special zones and to help them to increase that 5%, less than 5% rate to certain limit. Okay, they could provide initiatives to maybe U.S. firms to invest in those countries, maybe export financing or insurance for political risk. That's a possibility, right? Because that's a big part of investment decisions. Why would I want to invest in Egypt right now? Political risk. So maybe there might be initiatives to push them towards, if you want more trade with the region. That should be your first question to answer. Do you want more trade? Do you want these countries to be more globalized economically? If your answer is yes, and if you have an interest in yes, then you need more trade, more than 5%. At the same time, these countries desperately need external help for improving putting those financial reforms into action, and reforming their corporations in terms of their governance structure. Well, it's always a struggle. We have all these. We had this Sarbanes-Oxley, right? Because it came from all these scandals. So they might use our expertise on that. They might use our some external professionals to help them with their financial reforms. A good example is a recent law that got into effect in Turkey, Turkish Commercial Code. It's like a revolution in Turkey. So that's going to change. That's going to make the market more transparent. That's going to push small and medium firms, as well as large firms, to practice high accounting standards and make that information publicly available at the soonest time. So all of this, talking about taking Turkey as an example, I mean, take that. You can take this as an example. I think that's something that many corporations in the region need desperately. More transparent corporate government, and taking care of shareholders' rights, opening up to financial global markets. Foreign aid, I think foreign aid can be a curse or a driver. So I think foreign aid can be carefully designed towards small and medium-sized firms or entrepreneurs. Like why not open up entrepreneurship centers? And because they need more investment, they need entrepreneurs. You want to back up them with expertise and maybe capital. One of the a professor from I think Egypt talked about we need more cooperation within universities. I think that's another thing. One of the obstacles to business opportunities is the differences in business culture. Business culture, like reputation, there is a big deal, right? We have all these rules trying to enforce those ethical decision making. Well, they have different cultures. So exchange programs, exchange programs between universities there and here. Have students here or academics here and expose them to the business culture, to the business education. Have them take courses on corporate governance, have them take courses on business ethics. Okay? So that these are the future managers in those countries. Use scholarship opportunities like Fulbright to exchange academics between those two regions. But I think this transition will be much harder than Eastern European countries, because that at the time in the 90s, global economy was booming. But right now, with the Eurozone problems, it's going to be much harder for these countries to put reforms into place. And they will need, more than ever, they need the trade and global interaction to push them, put the reforms into action, and make sure that the entrepreneurs and private investors are encouraged, because big part of the social unrest is unemployment. They have big young population, and and social unrest, unemployment is never good. So I think the advanced nations can help with improving bilateral trades and creating all kinds of initiatives that will boost the trade between the nations. That's about I want to share. Thank you.
Going mostly to the Islamic type of studies. There are also universities like the American University. I think Dr. Saki yesterday mentioned that in Cairo. There is also the American University in Beirut, and I think that was Dr. Basili that mentioned that. Those are like implants in the system. But there are universities like Cairo University, probably Beirut University, that are more model like on the Western type of universities, campus, and curricula. I think that one of the important roles that I would assign, or I think that could be played by the academic world in the United States, would be to try to organize like regional encounters, using as partners some of these universities. In particular, those who are the state-ruled universities, not the privates like the American universities, not the Islamic ones like Azhar. But, and this may be a very important contribution to clarify both the elements that could be part of the agenda of these institutions, the ruling parties in government right now, and also to clarify the ideas in the American political groups that are having to do with defining the American policy in the Middle East. So I think I would suggest the possibilities of studying this alternative. And my question would be that, are the American universities willing to or ready to propose such type of encounters in the Middle East, like Congress for Democracy and Governance, that sort of things? That's what I would like to ask.
So I think the question really revolves around, is there an existing economic agenda from the groups currently in power, or will they need some assistance from the outside, and if so, are we equipped to provide that?
I'll try to do a little bit of answering that. Elections in Egypt probably happened well before they were ready to be imposed. So, I mean, in fact, if you take a look at some of the more moderate groups, they protested the elections. They didn't run at all. They didn't have the infrastructure to do so. The Muslim Brothers won because they had really the organization. So it was a choice between the Muslim Brothers or the old Mubarak regime, because those are the two groups that really had the organization, the Salafis as well, to get something done. Do they have an agenda? Probably they weren't ready necessarily. So whenever you have a regime change, you still need to keep the bureaucracy that knows how to run the day-to-day operations. I mean, you see this in Egypt, you see this in Iraq, and so, in some ways, that first regime that takes over is sort of set up to fail. Is there an exchange with American universities? Sure. I mean, this has been going on for a while. And you go to, Qatar, for example, has sort of a food court of American universities. You have a Georgetown School of Foreign Service, a Harvard School of Government, Yale Law School over there. But certainly this is, as a lot of people have talked about, this is one of the ways that perhaps the U.S. needs to get involved, is with this soft power and, the American educational system, the resources that we have, flexing this soft power in that way, perhaps is a way that reform can be engaged.
Yes, please.
I have a couple of things to say. One is that some of the institutions that have been invoked in the thoughtful musings of the gentlemen were AUB, AUC, American University of Cairo, and so on. I wouldn't be as quick, perhaps, as you might be, to dismiss these as foreign implants. And here's why. Some of these institutions have played a very key role in training elites, not just secular elites, but elites. I mean, for example, the Jesuits ran a college in Baghdad College, which operated for many years. It still operates today, but more as a secondary school. All of the elites in Baghdad today, Shiis, Sunnis, Druze, train there. So I wouldn't necessarily dismiss these institutions. And there's a more important reason why I wouldn't. And that is that people value American-style education, not European-style education. I mean, they might go to Germany, Australia, they might go to UK, but the model that people talk about is American-style education. It's a fact. And for example, there was an interesting poll done a few years ago by Zogby, and a major polling company, and they asked questions in 10 different countries, 2 non-Muslim countries, Venezuela and France, but they looked at 8 Muslim countries, 4 in the Middle East, 4 outside, Indonesia, Pakistan, and so on were included as well. So they said to people, what do you think about U.S. policy in Iraq? 5% approval, 4% approval, 3% approval, depending on the case. What do you think about U.S. policy between Israel and Palestine? 2% approval. What do you think of U.S. education? 70, 80, 90%. In fact, the only outlier was Iran, which was about 45 or 50%. And that was a particularly tense time in U.S.-Iranian relations. So the model of U.S. education is a very powerful one. And many entrepreneurs actually create institutions which appeal to people because they follow the American model. So, there's an American Lebanese University of Business in South Lebanon, not too far from a town where I spend a lot of time, a small little business school. It's really not very sophisticated, but they emphasize the American style. You find many of these places across the region. So I wouldn't underestimate the power of the American model. And this goes to, I think, the wisdom of your question, and that is this is an area for the U.S. officially, but also at the level of institutions to be involved. People want these kinds of exchanges. They yearn for the opportunity for young faculty to be able to come to the States, to spend maybe not a full semester, but a month, 2 months, get a sense of how things work. Maybe work on their English a little bit as well. Second point, the issue of the Ikhwan and were they ready? No. And for years they've been saying, Islamic law is our constitution, Sharia is the constitution. What does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to say that the Torah is our constitution if you're a Jew? I mean, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, what does that say about franchise law? What does that say about innovation law, copyrights, and so on? So, yes, there is a kind of sophisticated realm of Islamic banking, that's true. But for many of the sort of quotidian, prosaic issues that people face, Islamic law doesn't say anything. And most learned scholars say, basically, there's only a core set of truths within Islam that are basically undebatable. Prayer, the importance of fasting during Ramadan, and much else is debatable in terms of what should be done under what circumstances and so on. So the Brotherhood was not ready. Plus, as I was trying to say, there are many different arguments in this debate. Ironically, some of the more reformist members of the leadership, people like Muhammad Akif, Muhammad Habib, and so on, had been pushed out of the Brotherhood a year and a half before the January 25th revolution began. So they were not only unequipped, but some of the people who had been thinking along those directions had been pushed out in a leadership struggle. So they're sort of making things up as they go along in many cases. The thing to watch is the Constitution, which is now being debated. You got some very smart, sort of piously oriented people like the judge, Tariq al-Bishri, who are involved in this, and I think they're going to find some compromises and so on. But, they're trying to figure this out on the run. And that's a fact.
Well, just
Great. I think we just have time for one. Oh, I'm sorry.
A couple of things. Just these countries desperately need to improve their business culture. So if you look at the many of the Gulf countries, the largest firms belong to large merchants, rich families. So they are mostly family-owned firms. So they need the professional aspects to be implemented in their management of the firms and their relationship with shareholders and board of directors. So they desperately need an attempt to develop this culture of business. And U.S. is the place to get education in business. U.S. is the place, not Europe, not anywhere else, U.S. So I think American universities can do a lot better in creating exchange programs and maybe satellite campuses, provide executive education in those countries.
Great. We have time for just one more question, Tom.
Except on the subject of Egyptian subsidized bread, I didn't hear much about agriculture. Isn't there great room for substantial improvements in agricultural productivity output, even given the constraints on water throughout the region, especially in Iraq?
Have you heard the Dutch disease?
Yeah.
There's a term in
that's
economics,
good.
Dutch disease. It's if you have if you're endowed with natural resources, easy money pouring in from that sector, it basically kills off other sectors, and that's a curse for a lot of countries with those rich natural resources. It makes your exchange rate, foreign exchange, more valuable, makes you less competitive in other sectors, killing those other sectors. And manufacturing and services suffered big time in those countries. They don't have net value added to the products. They just, you take steel, glass in advanced nations, plastic, and you turn it into a car and you sell it for 50 times, 60 times, 100 times. They don't do that. So, yeah.
Egyptian farmers are very productive, though. I mean, in many cases, they get 3 crops a year now. Very, very productive. But there are, for example, Iraq is a real basket case agriculturally. Iraq had a very sophisticated system of irrigation going well back into the Ottoman period. And that system of irrigation decayed over the past decades for a number of reasons. Absence of pump parts during the sanctions period, during the Saddam Hussein years, and so on. General neglect, corruption, seizing of land by various elites, and so on. And Iraq is one of the few countries in the Middle East that doesn't have a water shortage. So with a good irrigation system, Iraq could have a thriving agricultural sector, taking advantage of its comparative advantage in growing subtropical, tropical fruits and that kind of thing. I mean, Iraqi dates were famous throughout the Middle East. Now date production is, last figure I saw, 7% of what it was at its peak. A lot of the date palms have been destroyed as a result of war, salinization, the land drying out, and that kind of thing, poor irrigation systems. So, there are some countries that really do have some potential for making some very substantial improvements.
Let me just add to that the U.S. and the European Union is not really doing the farmers in this region any favors with agricultural subsidies that we give to our farmers. And so this is true not just in the Middle East, but a lot of developing countries where they run up against this.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for a very elucidating presentation. If you don't mind joining me in a round of applause.
Great.
Now, we have refreshments outside to revive ourselves, and then we come to the penultimate moment of the conference. What have we learned?
Oh, great.
And that's where we wrap it up. I could ask some really, really insightful questions at this point. I've got some. But in the interest of trying to speed this up, I'd like to turn at this point to questions from the audience so that we can get a little bit closer to on schedule. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Dario Bauer. Well, first of all, I want to tell you that I'm delighted to be here. I've learned a lot of things about the Middle East. I'm grateful, and I'm very grateful to the persons that organized this meeting. I think it's badly needed to have meetings like these because it seems like there is a lot of confusion about what's going on in the Middle East. And himself, say what's going to happen in the next elections in Egypt, for instance. It was clear what was going to happen. But it seems like many people here didn't realize that. So there are plenty of, I'm sorry, is it clear? Okay. So there is a lot of confusion, both in the Middle East themselves as to the agenda that they may have to further a democratic process. And also here, we in the United States may not know all the appropriate information or details. One of the questions that you notice is that the institutions which are critical to obtain governance in a system, what are their agendas? For instance, groups that are ruling now in Egypt, were they prepared for this task? Let's take, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an old institution. It's an old institution previous to the revolution. They fill a gap, a vacuum that the government left in social issues, and they fill that gap. Their agenda may have changed later on when, after the war, the establishment of a new Israeli nation in the area. But certainly they probably were not ready to, with an agenda appropriate for democracy. They were caught off surprise. As a matter of fact, you know that they were very late in joining the groups that really started the revolution in Egypt. Think about the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. Is an institution that have occupied and was ruling half of the more than 130,000 mosques, public mosques in Egypt. More than 50% were ruled by by imams of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Egypt, maybe 50% of people were not illiterate. So their influence was very strong. That's why I tell you that it was easy to be predicted that Muslim Brotherhood will take the government in an open election, as it happens. Now, what's their agenda? We don't have that very clear. Maybe they themselves have it very clear, because as some of the illustrious participants here pointed out, there is a struggle also within the Muslim Brotherhood. So one important task, especially for the economic, for the academic world, would be try to help, to foster some understanding, maybe to help clarify which would be a proper agenda for these ruling institutions. In Egypt, you have different type of universities. There is, for instance, the Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University has been established more than 1,000 years ago, much before the main universities in Europe were founded. So, but that's going mostly